Thank you. The mic coming through, all right? Someone talked about Brandon. He initially was maybe how I got involved in this. We both live in New Jersey, and he was a high school student at the time, and he was working on this, and he got some names to contact that were prisoners. My name was one of them, and he came over to my house in Mapleshade, and he did an extensive research, and he took pictures and everything, and now I understand that he was in the reserves, and his unit has been called up. You may have had later information on that than I did. Initially, I was told by him that he was going to go to his unit, were going to Guantanamo, and then from there they were going to go to Afghanistan. But however, I think those plans have been changed. Now, about myself, it's nice that I have an opportunity to talk to you folks, talk about a story that's over 60 years old. You know, I can put all kinds of embellishments and make you think that I was a real hero, but really I wasn't. Back in 1940, I had to register for the draft, and I was put in 1A. So I learned from some people that I had met that the 28th Division, which was Pennsylvania National Guard, were going to be mobilized and sent up to Indiantown Gap, Pennsylvania for a year. Then after that year of service would be completed, we were supposed to be discharged and return home to our families. Well, I enlisted, and we, the armory where I signed up was on Ogons Avenue, right below Olney. My youth was spent a few miles down the road from here in the Stenton Park area around 16th and Cortlandt. And I grew up and went to local schools, and I graduated from Simon Gratz High School in 1936. So I kicked around a couple of jobs here and there, and finally around 1938, I landed a job at a steel mill up in Tacony called Dodge Steel. My father worked there. He was the carpenter of the family foundry. So I got a job there, and well, when I registered for the draft and I was put in 1A, I was among the first ones to leave. I signed up with the 28th Division, and we went to Indiantown Gap, Pennsylvania. But in the meantime, in February 1941, we left the armory on Ogons Avenue, and we marched over. Do you have that shot of? Maybe you didn't pick that one up. But we left the armory and marched over at Somerville Avenue to Reading Railroad Station, Tabor Road. And we went from there by train up to Lickdale, which is a little community adjacent to Indiantown Gap, and we were among the first troops. Well, we were the first troops actually to occupy Indiantown Gap, and General Edward Martin was the commanding officer, who later became governor of Pennsylvania. General Martin was a World War I veteran, and when the 28th Division was under the command, when their federal troops, they come under the command of the president. But the National Guard units themselves are under the command of the governor of the state. So General Martin, he used to ride around up there in Indiantown Gap on his horse, and if there was some activity going on, on the post. He might stop and you ran over and you reported to him, told him your rank and what unit you were in and what the present exercise was. Well, I never had basic training because when I enlisted, graduated from high school, I was a stenographer and typist. And Special Troops, the unit where I signed up, had 4 companies, military police and the signal company and the ordnance company and headquarters company. So they're responsible for all of the division activities. I wound up then the provost marshal who commanded he commanded the whole battalion of Special Troops. But in addition to that, he had a dual capacity as being the head of the military police. He was the provost marshal. And I fell into the job as being his stenographer. So I was pretty lucky. I was only in for a short period of time, and I got promoted to sergeant. And in those days, heck, you were only getting like $50 or $60 a month, and I didn't even have 120 days in yet to get the money for the rank. But those military police, we had a colonel from the head of that. He was a member of the Philadelphia Police Department, and Garwacky was one lieutenant, and the headquarters company furnished all of the personnel that were needed to function at division headquarters. And you had G1, G2, and G3, and G4, and each one of those outfits was commanded by a full colonel. And we trained then up at Indiantown Gap from February of 1941 until January of 1942. And while we were up there, many times every other weekend, I'd come home and come down on to Reading Terminal Market, and then the Reading Terminal station at 12th and Market, and then I'd take a local train up to Wayne Junction, and I lived in the area of Wayne Junction. Well, we kicked around up there at Indiantown Gap. I visited I was in Harrisburg numerous times, in Lebanon and in Hershey, but in the fall of 1941, we went on maneuvers down in North Carolina. And again, we as a headquarters unit, we were pretty much back all the time and didn't participate in the actual maneuvers themselves. And we were returning to Indiantown Gap on December the 7th. Pearl Harbor was bombed. And we said, where in the Pearl Harbor? Well, none of us knew at that time, but later on we learned rather quickly that the Japanese had attacked it. So things went along for a while, and President Roosevelt then declared war on Japan, and we returned to Indiantown Gap, and they said, no one is going to be discharged. Now you're in for the duration. Well, heck, here I was. I only had about a month to go, and I was going to be going home, which that didn't exist. I wound up with 5 years of service. So while we were up then at Indiantown Gap, the next move, the division had to relocate. And we went from Indiantown Gap down through the Midwest, and we wound up in Louisiana Camp Beauregard. And I was there in Beauregard for a while, and I moved up and I was promoted then to staff sergeant because I went to work for Colonel Hoban, who was he was head of G3 in the 28th Division, and many of the senior officers at this time were politically associated in a sense with the Republican Party up in Harrisburg. So Colonel Hoban was a judge, and while I worked for him, then I got promoted to staff sergeant. And while we were there, then I submitted an application for officer school, and one of the ones, the school that had the biggest number of application was the infantry school. So I put in the application, and then I went before a board of officers, and they interrogated me, and then it was their decision. They might have asked some personal questions, what you did before the war or something of that nature, and what's your present thing. And then they made the decision, and they said, okay, he's approved for OCS, Officer Candidate School. And this was the badge that we wore as at OCS. You were not permitted at OCS to show any rank. So even though I was a staff sergeant, all insignia of rank had to be removed from the uniform, and this OCS was put on the left pocket. Well, I stayed there, and I started there in April of 1942, and from there it was a rather strenuous course. They called it second lieutenants 90-day wonders, and I guess it was a wonder that we completed the course, but it was a tedious, long drawn-out thing, and some of the things were adaptations from West Point things, and we had to twice during our time we had to grade other members of our platoon. So in doing this, it would indicate that sometime later on some of these men were going to drop out of school, and you had to indicate when you made this choice why you put a certain individual first and why you put another man last. One day when we were out at what they called the Harmony Church area on one of our routine classes, they called out about 10 men, and away they went, and that was the last that we saw them. These were men that had flunked out of the course or didn't make the grade. But on July the 17th, which was just a few days ago, calendar-wise, on July the 17th, 1942, I was commissioned a second lieutenant, and they called it AUS, the Army of the United States. There was a difference between the Army of the United States and the regular Army. We always had the initials AUS when our serial number was 1287986, and that would be AUS. But then the regular Army personnel, they had a different. I went on furlough then after graduation, and after the furlough was completed, I had to report to Mineral Wells, Texas, at a camp down there called Camp Wallers at the time. Well, the mode of travel in those days was pretty much by train. And I took a train from Philadelphia out to St. Louis, and then from St. Louis down through all the way down into Louisiana to God, this is never, and I rode coach all that time. You never had a lot of money to spend when I was we're a member of a poor family at home. We were on welfare when I was a kid. I was the oldest of 6 kids, and my father was just a carpenter, and any time he could get a job, he might only get a $1 or $2 for the job. Well, anyhow, while I was down in Camp Wall in Mineral Wells, I was going to be an instructor there, but I received new orders. They said, Lieutenant, you have to join the 36th Division, and they're on maneuvers in North Carolina. Well, hell, I had just been there with the 28th Division the year before, but here I was going right back to the same place, but under different circumstances. And we I just got there, and I was kind of late in arriving, not that punctuality-wise, but the fact that the maneuvers were pretty much over. I participated in one of the last exercises, and my platoon, I was assigned to I Company of the 143rd Infantry, and my platoon was given a mission to guard the engineers while they built a bridge across the PD River down there. Well, the guide that took me to the wrong spot, and we were about a half a mile, and I sent out a couple of men down the creek and the mosquitoes that night. Oh God, they ate us alive. I had never experienced such a mosquito infestation as I did down there. Well, the maneuvers were over, and the next thing we went, we had to go out. We went by train up to Camp Edwards in Massachusetts, and we were going to go up there for amphibious training. Well, we arrived up there, and initially, when we were in a tent city, but eventually we moved to another location, and we had barracks. So we trained up there at Cape Cod and Falmouth and Coonamessett. There were 2 of the nearby towns which occasionally we would go into, and in one of the practice landings we destroyed some cranberry bogs. But when you're in combat, you just go and simulated combat, and unfortunately, I think the government had to pay for some of those cranberry bogs. But we stayed up. One of the things that I liked about this, on the weekends when I wasn't on duty, I would, it was a very short weekend, I'd take a bus from camp into Providence, and from Providence I'd take a train down to Grand Central, and at Grand Central I had to take a shuttle train over to Pennsylvania Station. Then from Pennsylvania Station I could come into North Philadelphia, then take the subway home. My father never owned a car while we were children, and we used public transportation at all times. So then I arrived home on a Saturday night. I'd say hi to Dad. My mother was dead. She died in 1939 of cancer, and Dad was then the father of 6 children, and I was the oldest. And we had 5 boys and 1 girl, and of the 5 boys, all of us were in service at one time or another. 2 of us were in World War II, and the other 3 were later on. But anyhow, while we were up there at Camp Edwards, there was one incident one time where I went in right after a Saturday morning inspection and grabbed the bus, and well, when I got on the bus, there were some men from my platoon there, and they were New York boys, and I felt that there was some partiality being shown by our company commander, but there was nothing that I could do about it. If the situation had been reversed and we were down in Texas, the members of the 36th Division that resided in Texas, they would have gone home and there would have been nothing said about it. But these men left early on a Saturday morning right after inspection, and they were told not to leave before noontime. So the company commander had the company fall in, and he checked and he found out that these men were missing, and they happened to be from my platoon. And when they returned, they were given company punishment for a week, which I felt was not justified. While we were up there then, we saw the Boston Red Sox play one time with Ted Williams, and then in April we were preparing to leave, and the last weekend that I had been home to see my wife, Helen. She's a Germantown girl. We weren't married at the time, and I knew or suspected that something was going to happen and that we were going to have to leave, but I didn't say anything to her, and I returned to Camp Edwards, and that was the last time I'd seen her then until June of 1945 when I got home. But I was part of the advance party that was sent down to New York and to make arrangements for the troops' arrival. Well, gosh, I got down there and this ship, I had never seen anything like this in my life. Here I was, a little guy from Philadelphia. I had only gone down to Wildwood maybe once or twice in my life, and the ship happened to be called the Oriente, and it was a member of the Cuban mail line in those days, and it happened to be the sister ship of the Morro Castle, which some of you might recall had a big fire up off of Asbury Park area back in the late 30s, and it was completely destroyed. Well, this ship was a cruise ship, and oh gosh, here again, the officers, I guess we got favored. We occupied the staterooms that the people were using when they would go on these trips, and the regular dining room was staffed by the regular waiters, and I guess they were merchant mariners, and gosh, everything was so nice to sit there. But then at the same time, the unfortunate part about that was our men, well, they were in the holds, and those conditions that the enlisted personnel had to endure were not too pleasant, because they were packed in, and they had these bunks. One night, and the guy on top got sick. The other guy on bottom, he got the results of the sickness. But this ship had been converted for troop transportation, and crossing the Atlantic, we had an uneventful trip there, and we had a couple of alerts during that time, and they say the smoking lamp is lit, okay, you're allowed to smoke, or the smoking lamp is out. And, so in those days I smoked, but I haven't had any tobacco since 1960. I smoked cigars. I tried a pipe, and the pipe used to burn my stomach and everything. So it was a combination of wanting to get out of it and health-wise that I stopped smoking. Well, we arrived then, and we went through the Straits of Gibraltar, and this was a sort of fascinating. As we went through and passed through, on the southern side, the African side, we could see parts of Tangiers, and the lights were there at night, and it was kind of interesting again. And we sailed then into the Mediterranean, and we landed in North Africa. Well, at that time, In North Africa, there was a lot of devastation. Originally, our division was supposed to be part of the invasion in North Africa. Well, the decision was made that we weren't quite combat ready, and they delayed that. So where the initial invasion of North Africa had taken place back around November, we came in as a reserve unit later on, and we were sent then to a bivouac area in a court forest outside of Rabat. Well, this Rabat, do you have that scenes of in Rabat of the parade? The July the 14th was just a few days ago. It's Bastille Day, and we participated in a parade there for the Sultan of Morocco, and it was very interesting. But he and some of his people were viewing it, and did you take these? Do you have them? Yeah. We participated in the town of Rabat. Boy, the stench sometimes. The refrigeration in those days that they was not good at all. And some of the places it's all the meat would be hanging out outside, and flies would be flicking all over it, and I don't know what the essence were for cooking and all, but it wasn't too pleasant anyhow. And but we participated in that parade, and a lot of times we would go in to Rabat. They had a canteen there, and we could get coffee and soda and some cake and some other things. And then the bivouac outside of Rabat, I told you we participated in that parade on Bastille Day. Well, we also had a duty. We were on coastal duty north of Casablanca, and we were out there just to watch and see that anything was coming and all that. So one morning when I woke up, my Jeep driver was asleep, and I thought, I'll take the Jeep myself, and I'll go out and see how things are going. Well, I took the Jeep, and I got out along the coast, and I was on a sandy road, and I got the brilliant idea, I wonder how fast this thing can go. Well, I found out, and I gave it the gun, and I hit a spot in the sand on the sandy road, and I lost control of the Jeep, and I crashed into a tree. I went through the windshield, and had some stitches put in my eye, and I was fined a month's pay. In those days, the junior officers were catching Hades all the time from Patton, and it was a very difficult thing. But Patton, blood and guts. It was his guts and our blood. That's the story that they always used to say. Well. While we were there, General Patton then successfully landed in Sicily, and the Sicilian campaign was very successful, and he got in and he beat Montgomery, and which was a great triumph for him, very egotistical. And while we were there then on the northern coast of Africa, General Eisenhower came in one day with British General Alexander, and we performed an exercise on the beach, a simulated landing. And after we had completed the exercise, Eisenhower called us over, and we had a group of about 10 officers, and he and Alexander made a few comments about how things we looked good, and shortly he would probably be leading us into combat, and then in this little group, Alexander made a comment about he was so impressed because of how big the soldiers were. Well, he thought, I guess, that they were all Texans. They weren't all Texans, because initially, when all of the National Guard units went into service, they were from the state in which the National Guard unit was from. But by the time we got there, we had men from all over, and a lot of them from up in the Northeast section in New York. And but anyhow, Alexander made that comment about how big the thing. Well, here again now, it's getting to September of 1943, and I had anticipated that I would have another friend with me here, but that I was going to have a little interlude, but we'll continue anyhow in the meantime. We bordered the ships for the invasion of Italy. Now, this situation, here we are, we're moving out into the Mediterranean, and it seems like ungodly time. You have your platoon, and I have a certain boat station on the ship that I'm assigned. So we come into the Gulf of Salerno. This is the morning of the invasion in September of 1943. Well, announcement came over the PA system by the general that the Italians, Italy had capitulated. They said, that makes no difference to us. We still have to go in because the Germans are there. Well, the Navy personnel, the coxswains on those little, we had a little LCVP, it's called landing craft for either vehicles or personnel. And they called out my number, and my platoon followed me. We got in the boat, and they lowered us down into the sea. Well, must have been hundreds. It seemed like there was hundreds of these little LCVPs all going in, and the Germans, they're up in the mountains. And well, that morning when we went in and landed, that coxswain did a commendable job. But we landed in water up to our waist, and now you got a rifle, you got ammunition. You're loaded down with so much stuff that you can hardly move. And some of the men, the ammunition carriers for the bazooka, the projectile was about this long, and a cape that they threw over them, and they could hardly move. You had a pack on your back with the things that you were going to use, so we landed in the water, and the artillery fire. Oh, what a feeling when the Germans had been zeroed in on these beaches, and it was just a devastating feeling when you're running across the beach. In fact, just a couple of weeks ago, on July the 4th, I went to a firecracker thing, and emotionally inside, I not outwardly, but with the fire things going off and the noise and everything, it just sort of sent me back to the invasion of Italy when all of that stuff was, and that was what I was thinking about. In one incident, everybody's running across the beach. They're trying to establish contact I got runner here, runner there. My name, we had the walkie-talkies then, and they called me Red Rooster. That was my, and that name was sort of originated with the men in my platoon because of the way I used to run around and try to just show, you know, in a sense you're showing off because you want to impress on the men how good you are, and there's nothing that you can't do that they won't do. So anyhow, we ran across the breach, and I dived into one of these ditches. And I come up, my face was all covered with blood. The sergeant was next to me. What happened, Lieutenant? Were you hit? No, I don't know. Well, what happened? Rather than buckle the strap under our chins because we were told that if you got hit with might cause concussion, everyone loosened. So when I dove in the ditch, the helmet went up, went down over, and scraped all the skin off my nose, and my face was full of blood. But anyhow, we got through with that incident, and we had a difficult to reorganize under these conditions. I had a couple of my men that got hit on the beach, and that was the last I ever saw them. But our initial objective in Salerno was a little town called Paestum, and we occupied that successfully. And then during the night, we moved to another location near Altavilla. And this is my downfall. We occupied, a position in an olive grove on the many hills of Mount Soprano, and we were in a defensive position. Well, the Germans, again, during the night, they're firing up all these flares, and it's a traumatic experience. You don't know what the heck what they mean, but eventually they had us surrounded in the position we were in, and our company was ordered to withhold or to hold while other elements of the battalion withdrew. And during this withdrawal, members of my platoon and myself, we were taken prisoners. Well, this feeling inside, it's indescribable. You've gone through and you've taken this training. I had some of my men with me when we got captured. We were fleeing. We were trying to get out we were told to get back to the beach the best we could. Well, unfortunately, and I got hit with some shrapnel while we were up there, and wasn't a real serious wound, but I received the Purple Heart. I had some shrapnel in the leg, and well, anyhow, here was the beginning of my internment as a POW. Now, I had only been in combat. I was in combat very briefly in Africa. While we were in Africa, I was sent on special duty one time. The 3rd Division was in reserve, and I was sent up to the 3rd Division for some training and preparation for our troops coming up. And in the meantime, the 3rd Division was committed, and we were told to go with them. So we went into Tunis and Bizerti and Algiers. I spent some time in Algiers, and then anyhow, the members of my platoon were taken prisoners, and now I was interrogated initially. What they're trying to find out information from you that's going to assist them in the battle, or some may give them an opportunity to have a very strategic position. So we moved to the rear then, and while we were under guard of the Germans, the German sergeant in charge of the detail, they had a wounded German officer that was on a litter, and we reached a small village on the way back, and the sergeant told his men to get some Italians and make them carry the litter for the officer. Well, they didn't respond quite quick enough for the Germans, and he opened up with his burp gun. He fired a few rounds at them overhead. Well, they came down pronto, and then they relieved my men of carrying this German officer, and we were then transported by truck, and you have seen the movies, Holocaust movies, of the conditions of those people traveling, locked up in those cars. Well, you're looking at one of the persons that was in one of those cars. They jammed us in there like, well, may say sardines, and it was difficult some of us would sit and the others would stand, and you're all locked in this boxcar, and we're hungry, and there's no facilities for toilet or anything like that, and well, you wind up sometimes using your helmet for that. But we arrived then. We went up through the Po Valley, locked in the car, and we got up to around the Brenner Pass, and they pulled us out of the cars, and they counted us, and then got back in again, and then we got up into Austria, and Stalag 7A was in there, and we ran into or met some British POWs. Well, they very hospitable to us, and at that time we hadn't had anything to eat maybe for quite a while, and they offered us food and cigarettes, and we stayed there for a while, and then the next leg of our journey, we arrived at a called Luckenwald, and Luckenwald was interrogation point. I spent 2 weeks in solitary confinement. Now, initially, they had this long building with a whole lot of cells and a rather high ceiling, about 10 feet high, and I don't know whether it was about 8 feet wide, the cell, and they had a little window on the outside, which we could not reach because it was too high, and the guards would be going up and down, and they look through the peephole and see inside what you were doing. Well, when they put me in the cell, prior to that, they took me in a room, and I had to disrobe completely so that they see that you had nothing that you could use to amuse yourself while you were in the cell. So I had some paper money, $7 or $8, they issued the paper money, and the seal on there was a gold seal, so that they would know that Americans would know that money was from Africa. Well, when I took off my clothes, I rolled the money down inside the sock, and And then after I had completely disrobed and they saw that everything was okay, then they told me to and they put me back in the cell, and I just stayed there. Now, in one corner of the cell, they had a bed, and the other corner they had a table, and we had a chair. And each day, a Russian soldier, prisoner, would bring our daily ration into us, which consisted of a cup of ersatz coffee and maybe a small piece of black bread and a potato, and that was our ration for the day. Well, not knowing how often you were going to, we all, you attempt to what we call squirreling, saving food so you don't eat it all at once. And anyhow, one day the door opened while I was in there, and the German captain walked in, and he had two soldiers with him. And he said, I want to talk to you, Lieutenant. Well, I brazenly stood up and said, all I have to tell you is my name, rank, and serial number. I'm Joseph Barrett. I'm a second lieutenant, and my serial number is this, and that's all. Well, under the Geneva Convention rules, which were brought up at the end of World War I, there was a certain standards that were supposed to be used to handle prisoners of war, and that was all we had to say. So he became rather indignant, and he says, okay, he says, you might as well stay in here. You can rot in here because nobody knows you're here. Out he went. Well, I sit there then, and I'm saying maybe some prayers, and please get me through this, dear Lord, and watch over me. And so I sat there, and sometimes that guard would look in, and he sees you were doing, he'd rap that door with his. At no time did I ever have any physical abuse. I guess the fact that it was officers may have had something to do with it. We handled the situation in such a way that this captain then says that when he came back again later on, they escorted me down to his quarters. Well, the first thing to do, he reaches in, he says, cigarette, Lieutenant? Yeah, I'll take yeah. Well, again, I smoked and were happy to get the cigarette. It was a sort of a relief to be able to puff on the cigarette, and his name was Captain Williams. He says to me, where are you from, Lieutenant? I said, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Oh, he says, let me tell you, I was in the Catholic hospital in Philadelphia with pneumonia a couple of years ago, and the Catholic hospital, I think it was called St. Joseph's on Girard Avenue in Philadelphia. And he convinced me from the way he talked that he was very knowledgeable about Philadelphia. And there was a couple other things. Then he asked me some questions which I really couldn't answer. We had a gun that was mounted on a railroad car, and he was asking some questions about that in the interrogation, which I couldn't answer. And but he did impress me. Well, what happens if in the conversation in this interrogation he gets a few words from you and a few words from him? They can piece together something that is going to be advantageous for them in a military manner. So from this camp then, I'm through Berlin, and I arrived. I just told you about we spent time recuperating in a Catholic hospital on Girard Avenue. I spent my 25th birthday in solitary confinement. I was born in October 1918, and I'm 85 years old now. And at that time, I was in my mid-20s, and if I may, I would like to read to you. We were all lovers, I guess, in a sense. My sweetheart, Helen, lived in Germantown. I write to her, and this is a wartime log that was given to us by the YMCA. YMCA did a commendable job for prisoners of war. We had athletic equipment that they provided. We had a musical equipment. Well, in writing this, my wife's name was Helen Lanigan, and I called her Lanny. And I'll just read I call this Before the Dawn. This is my penmanship. It was excellent in those days, but very poor today. It says, I kissed you and said, so long, honey, that unforgettable weekend, the latter part of March. I was suspicious, but didn't think it would happen so soon. My last farewell. Our post was the center of activity. Everyone was hustling about trying to complete his work before departure. Now, I'm writing this to my wife, who's my sweetheart, as a prisoner, see. And then I said we boarded the ship that day and we started for unknown shores. The New York skyline faded in the horizon, and the shores of the U.S. became a memory. The commencing of this trip wasn't very pleasant for me, but after 4 or 5 days I found my sea legs and overcame my sickness. We had several alerts, but aside from that, the majority had a fascinating voyage. Then I preface the next section. It says, our division, part of the Fifth Army, was among those to participate in the invasion of Italy. The stars and stripes were waving majestically from the mast as we boarded our ship. Many of the courageous men whose souls would soon pass into eternity little dreamed they would be looking at the colors that signify life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for the last time. To the infantry, the queen of battle, she treads upon hostile lands bravely and aggressively, and her children died gallantly. September the 9th, this is the day we landed. Hundreds of boats were dancing in the whitecaps of the blue Mediterranean. The ships further out in the Gulf of Salerno fired a halo of red death over heads at enemy aircraft. Dawn was breaking, forming a red haze on the mountains, skyline like the glow of a huge fire, and our small boat approached the shores of Paestum. We had no sooner cleared the beach than Jerry started to bracket in with field artillery. Fortunately, the Italians had quite a few irrigation ditches running parallel to the beach. These offered us cover from the dreaded field pieces. We ran like scared rabbits, darting from cover to cover through those blazing fields of machine guns and artillery fire to our reorganization line. As the sun set on that historic day, we occupied Capiccio, our objective. Several men in the company were wounded, and 2 others answered the final call. Well, I kept this log up until Christmas of that year, and then I wrote to her on that day and said, December the 25th, Christ was born, a Christmas I'll always remember. Honey, if your thoughts were the same as mine, and I'm sure they were, I'll always wager those beautiful brown eyes of yours were moist with golden teardrops. Tomorrow is another day, and our future is filled with love. Don't be melancholy, sweetheart. I think and pray of you night and day. Christmas a year ago? Yes, I was there, honey, but it was a land of make-believe this time. I was lonely, too. If I only had you in my arms, there will be another day. Till we meet again, Lanny, you're the most precious thing in the world. And that's the last that I had written in there. And in this book, we have numerous pictures that were taken by the Germans, and they gave us prints. So we had numerous shows. We produced a minstrel show, which of course you're not allowed to have them anymore because of the blackface, but it was great. And the female impersonators, the more you saw them, the more beautiful they seemed. But when some of the fellas did get paid up for, they did a great job. And we, from there, Flag 64, there were two names for the town. The German name was called Altbergen, and the Polish name was called Schuben. I have a map here of prison camps, and you can see the location of where we were in Poland. So while we were here, we again, many of the things that we did as prisoners were adaptations from things that the British had taught us. And we called the nickname for the Germans was goons. And if you remember the Popeye cartoon where they had that Alice the Goon in there, well, the senior German officer, who was a commandant, his name was Oberst Schneider, and each time we would have what they call the appel twice a day, once in the morning and once in the evening, and that way we had to go out and fall in, and we had a set formation, and they would make it easier for them to count, so that we would be 10 abreast and 5 deep. So he'd go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, and he knew he had 50 people. Now,
Elizabeth Gaines, please come to the circulation desk. Elizabeth Gaines to the circulation desk, please. Thank you.
If they didn't have the count didn't come up, well, then we stayed there, and we stayed there, and maybe a half an hour, 45 minutes until they finally rectified it. Well, what happened, one of the buildings that we occupied, we had converted it into be used for hospital facilities. Even though we didn't have any medications to provide the doctors, we had about 4 or 5 American doctors that had been captured, and they lived in this building. And I keep looking around. I keep thinking that he's going to flash something up here, but I guess not. Okay, and they in the camp then there were 2 soldiers that just roved about the camp all the time, and what they're looking to see, anything unusual or suspicious, so that they can report it to the city. Well, we called those 2 men the ferret and the weasel. So anytime if we were in our building or in our quarters, and we would be talking in a group or something, and one of them come in, somebody would holler, "Goon up!" And right away all conversation would cease. Then these 2 guys, they walked in. They come. They weren't young guys, stormtroopers though. So anyhow, they kept looking in there. Now we had a radio. Germans couldn't find it, and we called the radio the Bird. So we had that secured and hidden in one of the rooms in one of the buildings that we called the Big House. The area that we were in the camp of All Flag 64 had formerly been a school in Poland, and the Germans had taken it over, and they put all this barbed wire around it, and the machine gun towers in the corners and everything. So when the Bird would be singing, we would be stooging. So he'd say, "Okay, Joe, you got to stooge." Well, the Bird located in this room, we would stand at the bottom of the stairway and just monitor and watch to see if either one of these two German guards would be patrolling. And we would say, if the radio was on now and we're receiving from BBC in London, we holler, "Goon up," and immediately they turn it off and conceal it. So that went on, and they never did, and I never saw the radio neither. And when we evacuated the camp, the senior American officer at the time had a set of bagpipes, and the radio was concealed inside the bagpipes when we marched out of the camp. Yeah. Now, you've seen these Hogan Heroes. They're fantastic. That's amusing. Great humor in there. But at the same time, when you're enduring that, it's not quite so humorous. So, the Germans are not quite as stupid as maybe Sergeant Schultz was portrayed in that series. But anyhow, as I used to watch them, I got a big kick out of that. But everything in there that was portrayed is actual. I mean, even though there was a humorous tone attached to it here. So we would, anyhow, with the Birds singing each night then, one of our men would come into the barracks and read the news of that day about what was going on with the war. So we were pretty much abreast of what was going on. And on D-Day, on June the 6th, we knew that the American troops had landed. But I never got to that part of it because all my service was in Africa and a short service in Italy. But then we had a tunnel, which you also have seen in these movies. And the tunnel was in the building where I lived. And we had this long building, all one section, and we had divided our up into cubicles because we had bunk beds that we slept in, and we would set the beds so that we would have a certain degree of privacy, and then everyone, maybe 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 groups could all have their own little cubicle. If you wanted to participate in an escape plan, you couldn't just execute this on your own. You had to. We had a group of seniors, American officers that were the escape committee, and you would present your scheme to them, and if they thought it was feasible, they in turn would okay it. Now, the next thing, you have to get the rest of the POWs in on this so that they can participate. Well, one night we had an affair, and our band played. We called it the Bloody Gut, and there was some gambling simulated and other things, and a couple of men pretended that they were inebriated. So they had some potato skins or something, and they tried to make a concoction, and then after this affair was over, rather than return to their barracks, they were out in the camp now, in the yard area, and they were carrying on vociferously and making all kinds of noises and everything. And well, the Germans, they took the bait. They come in and they took these three men and took them out of the camp. They took them across the street. They interred them in the guardhouse, which was on the other side of the road from where we lived. And in the morning, when we got up, the men were gone. Well, what happened was we had keys made to get to the cells that they had the men in. Well, the escape was not a complete success. So after 3 or 4 days, they were all captured, and then they were put in confinement for a month. They weren't allowed to come out. But the tunnel in the barracks where I lived, between the two halves of the building, we had a washroom, and in the washroom, in one corner, they had a large kettle embedded in concrete, and that was to wash clothes with if we wanted to wash clothes. Well, what we did, they removed the kettle, they dug down. I was never in the tunnel. Then after they dug down, they start out toward the fence. Now, what are we going to do with the dirt? They got all this dirt and they don't know where the hell to put it. Well, at night, there was a crawl space between the ceiling and the roof, and we used to hand the dirt out and lift up, and we had boxes that had food in it, and we kept storing it. I don't know how long that existed, but most of those temporary buildings have all been demolished. The school itself is still there, but we had to hide that dirt. And then another problem was how you're going to shore up the dirt so it doesn't cave in on them. Well, the bunks that we occupied, we didn't have a mattress and a spring. We had a bunk bed with boards in it, and then you had a sack with sawdust. That was your mattress. So we kept taking these boards out from our beds, and they used them then to shore up the dirt from falling in while the men were digging. Well, that got to such a point that you'd go to try to sleep at night, and part of you'd be down underneath in all kinds of positions. But when we left the camp in January of 1945, and they took us outside to count us again before we left, some of the men were missing. And they counted them. Well, they couldn't wait any longer, so they left. Well, these men hid in the tunnel. And then later on, they were liberated by the Russian forces that were coming from the east. And some of those men came down through Odessa and into the Mediterranean, then into Italy, and then home. And they got home sometime before we did. The food was atrocious. The Germans provided us with potatoes, one potato, Firesight's coffee, and some kind of cheese. Oh God, it was like moving, or I don't know whether it was Limburger or what it was. But anyhow, one of the big things, we were divided into what we called mess groups. And we had about 8 men in the mess group, and each evening we would go up to the building, this one building, and get hot water and whatever else they may have prepared that evening. And now you've got this loaf of bread. How are you going to divide it up evenly? And every one of us, we're all selfish at this time. Everyone's looking out for himself. So today, I cut the bread, and I get last choice. Tomorrow, you cut the bread, and you get last choice. So this is the way we did it. So that when it was your turn to cut, you would, gee, I have to get this because I don't. But the little end pieces sometimes used to come down like that, and they weren't quite as big as the other pieces. So you usually wound up with an end piece, but we attempted to divide that loaf of bread up as evenly as we could. The Red Cross, there were food parcels that were distributed through the Red Cross. And these food parcels contained a pound can of powdered milk and a pound can of meat, some sugar cubes, small can of liver pate, 2 ounces of instant coffee. That was the first time I had ever seen instant coffee. Yeah. And a little 2-ounce can of jelly, package of sea biscuits, some D-bars, and 5 packs of cigarettes. Well, we then, and when these parcels didn't come in on a regular basis, we were lucky we received one once a month. They come into Geneva, and then from there they were sent out to the different camps, and sometimes some of them would be stolen before we would receive them. So we bartered among ourselves. Maybe you would give up two or three D-bars for, a D-bar for a couple of packs of cigarettes, or if you're a heavy smoker, you might give the cigarettes up to get something else. And one of the 2 items was that 1-pound can of powdered milk, and the D-bars and the cigarettes, well, and the biscuits. Well, in the wintertime, we used to try to make ice cream, and we'd scrape the snow off from outside, and this little can of jelly we would mix together and pretend that was ice cream. Then another thing we did, we made some chocolate pies with the 1-pound can of margarine and the biscuits. We would break up the biscuits in small crumbs, put some margarine in that to give it some body, and put it around a dish, and then the powdered milk we would mix with some chocolate, and it created like a chocolate pie. And then we would take that up to the kitchen, and they would bake it for us. But the heat in the building that we occupied, they were no good at all. We were always cold. They had two heaters, and they used peat moss pressed in briquettes, and it didn't radiate much heat. But in addition to that, our families received food labels from the government, food labels and also tobacco labels. Now, with the tobacco labels, you would mail the tobacco label to the tobacco company, and they in turn might, whatever you chose, cigarettes or cigars, you might get a couple of cartons of cigarettes or a box of cigars. And the food then